The biting October wind howled through the gaping windows of Newark Castle, carrying the stench of rotting flesh and the distant echo of laments that reverberated through the cold stone corridors. There, on a squalid bed, lay a man whose ragged breathing sounded like the last gasp of a collapsing kingdom. His trembling hands clutched the blood-stained sheets as his glazed eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if searching in the dancing shadows for a redemption that would never come. It was October 19th, 1216, and John, once King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy, lay dying alone, abandoned even by his own thoughts. But it hadn't always been this way. There was a time, not so long ago, when this same man strode through the halls of power with the arrogance of one who believed he held the world in his hands. John, the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, was born in 1167 as a golden promise in a dynasty that ruled half of France and all of England. His baptismal name carried the hope of a glorious future, but fate, with its cruel irony, already whispered other plans. During his youth, John observed the brutal game of power from afar. His older brothers, Henry the young king, Richard the Lionheart, and Geoffrey of Brittany, vied with each other and against their own father for the lands that comprised the vast Plantagenet Empire. It was a bloody spectacle of unrestrained ambition, where familial loyalty meant less than a copper coin. John learned early that survival depended not on honor but on cunning, and the ability to identify the precise moment to strike a dagger in the back of an enemy, even if that enemy were his own kin. When Richard departed for the Third Crusade in 1189, leaving behind a kingdom he knew more through legends than facts, John tasted the sweet flavor of true power for the first time. As regent, in fact, he moved through the English palaces with the ease of one who had finally found his place in the world. His eyes, then bright and calculating, studied every move of the nobles, every whisper of the servants, every tremor in the voices of those who dared to question his authority. He was a predator in his natural habitat, and for a few years it seemed that fate finally smiled upon the despised youngest son. Richard's death in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt during the siege of the insignificant castle of Chaillot-Chabrol, opened up a horizon for John that he had never imagined reaching. The throne of England, the vast French lands, control over trade routes connecting entire continents, all this now belonged to him by right. At his coronation ceremony in Westminster Abbey on May 27, 1199, John felt the weight of the golden crown upon his head as a divine confirmation of his destiny. Bells pealed throughout London, and the cheers of the crowd echoed through the heavens like a celestial choir celebrating his ascension. But power, as John would soon discover, was a ravenous beast that devoured its own masters. In the early years of his reign, he managed to maintain the illusion of control. His decisions were implemented with brutal efficiency, his enemies silenced with a combination of gold and steel, and his subjects bowed before his presence with the awe he believed he deserved. Reports arriving from his French lands spoke of abundant harvests, overflowing coffers, and a seemingly submissive nobility. It was a symphony of success that lulled John into a false sense of invincibility. However, in the shadows of the grand halls, the seeds of discord began to ferment. Philip Augustus of France, a man whose patience was matched only by his thirst for revenge, observed every move of the English king with the attention of a vulture awaiting the moment of death. Correspondence intercepted by French spies revealed the first cracks in John's administration: disgruntled subjects, nobles questioning decisions, merchants complaining of exorbitant taxes. What began as isolated whispers gradually transformed into a symphony of discontent that echoed from castle to castle, from village to village. The first major humiliation came in 1204, when John lost Normandy to Philip Augustus. The military campaign that should have been a triumphant stroll turned into a shameful rout. Castles that had belonged to the Plantagenet family for generations were abandoned without a fight. soldiers deserted en masse, and John himself was forced to flee across the English Channel in a vessel that tossed like a leaf in the wind. When he finally set foot on English soil, his eyes no longer shone with the same confidence. There was now a shadow of doubt in them, a reflection of the implacable reality that began to assert itself over his fantasies of greatness. The loss of Normandy was only the first domino in a long sequence that would fall upon John in the following years. His attempts to reconquer the French lands resulted in a series of military defeats that consumed the royal treasury like a wildfire devouring dry straw. The taxes levied on the English nobles to fund these failed campaigns created a resentment that grew like an infection, silently spreading through the upper echelons of society. In taverns and marketplaces, the king's name was uttered with the same tone one would use to speak of a plague or a divine curse. If you've been following reports like this one on history's darkest moments, consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss the next episodes revealing how absolute power can destroy even the most powerful men of their time. The conflict with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury was the final straw that transformed discontent into open rebellion. When the Pope placed England under interdict in 1208, forbidding the celebration of sacraments throughout the kingdom, John responded with a fury that revealed more desperation than authority. He confiscated church properties, exiled bishops, and went so far as to threaten death to any cleric who dared to defy his authority. But his actions, far from demonstrating strength, only highlighted how much he had lost control of the situation. The church itself, which for centuries had legitimized the power of kings, now turned against him like a mother rejecting a bastard son. During these dark years, court witnesses reported disturbing changes in John's appearance and behavior. Chroniclers of the time described how his hair, once golden like a lion's, had turned gray and thin. His face, once full and rosy from good wine and good food, took on a cadaverous pallor that violently contrasted with bloodshot eyes. His movements, previously fluid and confident, became nervous and erratic, like those of a cornered animal sensing the proximity of hunters. John's personal letters, preserved in the royal archives, reveal a mind in gradual disintegration. His handwriting, once elegant and controlled, became irregular and shaky. Sentences would begin with one idea and end with a completely different one, as if his thoughts were interrupted by invisible ghosts whispering doubts in his ears. In a letter addressed to the Pope in 1212, John wrote, "The stones of my kingdom cry out against me, and even the air I breathe seems to conspire for my ruin." It was the outburst of a man beginning to understand that he had lost not only territories and treasures, but also his sanity. The papal excommunication in 1209 was the blow that definitively broke John's prestige. In a kingdom where royal legitimacy depended on divine approval, being rejected by the church was equivalent to a political death sentence. The subjects, terrified of being dragged to hell along with their cursed king, began to distance themselves from him as if his mere presence were contagious. Nobles who once vied for the privilege of kissing his hand now avoided his gaze, and the palace servants carried out his orders with the reluctance of those handling contaminated objects. The situation became even more desperate when Philip Augustus, taking advantage of John's excommunication, began to organize an invasion of England with the papal blessing. The prospect of seeing French soldiers marching along English roads, carrying banners blessed by the church, transformed the subjects' diffuse fear into collective hysteria. Entire cities began to prepare for siege, stocking food and building makeshift fortifications, while the most powerful nobles whispered among themselves about the possibility of abandoning John before it was too late. It was in this context of widespread panic that John made one of the most humiliating decisions of his life, to completely submit to Pope Innocent III. In May 1213, before a crowd of witnesses at Dover Castle, John knelt before the papal legate and surrendered the crowns of England and Ireland as symbols of his total submission. The ritual, carefully orchestrated to maximize humiliation, was described by chroniclers as the symbolic death of a king who was no more than a shadow of his former self. Reconciliation with Rome brought only temporary relief. The threat of French invasion was temporarily averted, but the price paid for this security was the transformation of England into a kind of papal vassal. John, who once boasted of bowing before no man, now owed formal allegiance to a pontiff who lived thousands of miles away. The irony of the situation did not escape his critics, who began to call him the king who reigns by permission of Rome, but worse was yet to come. The Battle of Bouvines, on July 27, 1214, was the final nail in the coffin of John's continental ambitions. The coalition he had formed with Emperor Otto IV and other enemies of Philip Augustus was crushed so completely that it would have been comical if it weren't tragic. John, who had invested years of planning and untold fortunes in this campaign, saw his allies captured or killed, while he himself was forced to flee the battlefield like a common coward. News of the defeat reached England even before he could cross the Channel, and when he finally landed at Portsmouth, he was received not with royal honors, but with an embarrassing silence that was more devastating than any insult. The defeat at Bouvines was the catalyst that transformed the latent discontent of the English nobles into open revolt. The barons, already exhausted by the exorbitant taxes imposed to finance John's failed military adventures, saw in the humiliation of Bouvines definitive proof that their king was not only incompetent, but also cursed. Led by figures like Robert Fitzwalter and Eustace de Vesci, they began to organize a confederation that had a very clear objective to drastically limit John's powers, or if necessary, remove him completely from the throne. The months that followed Bouvines were marked by an atmosphere of conspiracy that permeated all levels of English society. In taverns, merchants whispered about the king's latest humiliations. In castles, nobles exchanged coded correspondence about plans of resistance. In monasteries, monks copied ancient texts that spoke of the right of subjects to rebel against tyrants. It was as if all of England were a pressure cooker about to explode, and John, isolated in his increasingly empty palaces, seemed to be the only person who did not understand the gravity of the situation. John's attempts to regain lost loyalty through concessions and promises only confirmed his weakness in the eyes of the rebellious barons. Each new offer of negotiation was seen not as a gesture of goodwill, but as evidence of his desperation and vulnerability. Contemporary chroniclers reported that, during these meetings, John frequently lost emotional control, swinging from pathetic pleas to outbursts of impotent rage within minutes. His voice, once firm and authoritative, had become shrill and trembling, like that of a man who no longer believed his own words. The situation reached a critical point in the spring of 1215, when the rebellious barons marched on London with an army that grew larger each day. The capital of the kingdom, which should have been the last bastion of royal authority, opened its gates to the rebels without resistance. It was a collective betrayal that left John completely isolated, reduced to negotiating with his own subjects, as if he were a prisoner begging for clemency. The symbolism was devastating. The King of England, surrounded by enemies in his own capital, being forced to accept terms dictated by men who theoretically owed him absolute obedience. The signing of the Magna Carta at Runnymede on June 15, 1215, was the moment John Plantagenet ceased to be a true king. The document, which drastically limited his powers and established mechanisms to control his actions, was signed by hands that visibly trembled. Witnesses reported that, during the ceremony, John stared at the parchment as if he were reading his own death sentence, and in a way he was. The Magna Carta was not just a political treaty, it was the death certificate of absolute monarchy in England, and the birth of a system where the king would be just one man among others, subject to the same laws that governed his subjects. But John, even defeated and humiliated, couldn't accept his new status as a constitutional king. In the months following the signing of the Magna Carta, he secretly began to plan his revenge. Letters were sent to the Pope requesting the annulment of the document, foreign mercenaries were hired with the remnants of the royal treasury, and alliances were forged with other enemies of the English barons. It was the last gasp of a man who preferred utter destruction to ultimate submission. The ensuing Barons' War was less a military campaign than a grotesque spectacle of national self-destruction. John, supported by French mercenaries and Welsh soldiers, confronted his own subjects in a series of battles that devastated the English countryside. Cities were sacked, castles destroyed, and entire families were exterminated in an orgy of violence that seemed to have no end or purpose. It was as if England itself was tearing itself apart in a desperate attempt to expel the poison that had infected it for years. During the Civil War, John's last illusions about his kingly nature were brutally shattered. His mercenary soldiers treated him not with the respect due to a monarch, but with the coarse familiarity reserved for any employer. His own English allies spoke of him behind his back as if he were a necessary nuisance, someone who needed to be tolerated only until the situation normalized. Letters intercepted by the rebels revealed that some of his supporters were already secretly planning his replacement by a more competent member of the Plantagenet dynasty. The invitation extended by the rebellious barons to Prince Louis of France to assume the English throne was the final blow to what remained of John's pride. Knowing that his own subjects preferred to be ruled by a foreigner rather than continue to endure his reign was a humiliation that surpassed all previous ones. Louis, son of Philip Augustus and John's son-in-law, through his marriage to Blanche of Castile, landed in England in May 1216, and was received as a liberator by a population exhausted by the Civil War. The irony was bitter. The man who spent his life fighting against French influence now saw a French prince acclaimed as England's savior. The last months of John's life were a calvary of constant escapes and humiliating defeats. Pursued simultaneously by the rebellious barons and Louis's forces, he wandered through the northern counties like a ghost of himself, followed only by a handful of loyal soldiers and a few courtiers who had nowhere else to flee. His hair, now completely white, was constantly covered by hats and hoods to hide the premature baldness caused by stress. His clothes, once symbols of royal magnificence, became rags that barely concealed a body consumed by illness and despair. The last letters dictated by John reveal a mind tormented by paranoia and remorse. He constantly spoke of imaginary conspiracies, accused loyal servants of treason, and alternated between moments of impotent fury and periods of deep melancholy. In a letter addressed to his son Henry, only 9 years old, John wrote, "My son, when these words reach you, I may be nothing more than a bitter memory. Learn from my mistakes, for a kingdom lost through incompetence can never be regained by force." It was the confession of a man who finally understood the magnitude of his failure. The illness that struck him down in his last days was described by chroniclers as a malignant fever that consumed his body from the inside out. Doctors hastily summoned diagnosed an inflammation of the intestines, possibly caused by dysentery, but some whispered about poisoning. The truth, lost in the mists of time, mattered less than the symbolism. John was literally being consumed by decay, as if his physical body finally reflected the state of decomposition of his kingdom and his soul. John's last days at Newark Castle were a spectacle of utter desolation. The few courtiers who still attended him kept a respectful distance, not out of reverence, but out of disgust and fear. The stench emanating from the royal chamber was so repulsive that servants took turns cleaning the room, spending the least possible time near the dying king. John, delirious with fever, spoke to people who weren't there, begged forgiveness from enemies long dead, and occasionally shouted military commands to phantom soldiers who existed only in his fragmented mind. On the night of October 18th, 1216, John briefly awoke from the semi-consciousness into which he had fallen in the preceding days. With the temporary lucidity that sometimes precedes death, he looked around the dark, empty room, as if finally understanding where he had arrived. There were no nobles paying homage, no clergy offering last rites, not even servants awaiting his last words. He was alone, utterly alone, as perhaps he had never been in his entire life. The crown, symbol of his divine authority, lay forgotten on a side table, covered in dust, and as irrelevant as any other decorative object. His last words, according to conflicting accounts, were a mixture of repentance and curses. Some said he asked God's forgiveness for his sins. Others claimed he cursed the barons who had betrayed him. The truth likely incorporates both versions. John died as he had lived, torn between guilt and rage, unable to fully accept either his responsibility for his own failings or the legitimacy of the resistance he had faced. Death arrived silently, almost as a courtesy. There was no dramatic agony, no memorable last pronouncements, no illustrious witnesses to record the moment. John Plantagenet, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Normandy, simply stopped breathing on a cold October morning, leaving behind only the echo of his own failures and the persistent smell of decay that had marked his final days. News of his death was met with an embarrassing silence that spoke louder than any lament. There was no official mourning period, no elaborate ceremonies, no crowds mourning the loss of their sovereign. On the contrary, England seemed to sigh with relief, as if it could finally begin to heal wounds that had been bleeding for years without hope of healing. Even his few remaining allies reacted to the news with a mixture of sadness and relief, recognizing that John's death might be the only way to restore some stability to the devastated kingdom. The funeral was a perfect reflection of the life John had led, modest, hurried, and largely ignored. His body was buried in Worcester Cathedral, not because he had chosen this place out of devotion or tradition, but simply because it was the closest place where the bishops agreed to receive the remains of a king who had spent much of his reign in conflict with the church. Not even in death did he achieve the dignity he always believed he deserved. The headstone marking his grave is curiously simple for someone who once controlled territories stretching from the Pyrenees to Scotland. There are no grand eulogies, no references to his supposed virtues, not even a complete list of his titles. It's just a cold stone marking the spot where lies a man whose life became synonymous with royal failure and political incompetence. Occasional visitors, over the centuries, often express surprise at discovering that a king of England is buried so modestly, almost as if posterity itself wanted to forget his existence. But perhaps that is precisely what makes John's tragedy even deeper and more disturbing. He wasn't a memorable tyrant like Nero, nor a failed conqueror like Napoleon at St. Helena. He was simply an ordinary man who found himself invested with extraordinary power at a crucial moment in history, and found himself utterly inadequate to the task. His tragedy doesn't lie in spectacular crimes or in grand ambitions poorly executed, but in the sheer mediocrity of someone who had all the resources to be great and chose to be small. History, that implacable judge who canonizes heroes and condemns villains, reserved for John Plantagenet the cruelest punishment of all, irrelevance. He is not remembered as a great king, nor as a great tyrant, but simply as the man who lost everything and left nothing of value behind. Even his mistakes, which could at least serve as lessons for future generations, were so banal and predictable that they became mere examples of administrative incompetence in specialized history books. His most enduring legacy, ironically, was Magna Carta, a document he signed against his will and tried to annul as soon as possible. The limitation of royal power that so terrified him in life became the foundation upon which the entire Western constitutional tradition was built. John, who dreamed of being remembered as an absolute monarch, ended up being remembered only as the king who was forced to admit that no man, not even those anointed by divinity, is above the law. And perhaps that is the most disturbing lesson that emerges from the wreckage of his life. Absolute power corrupts, not only morally, but also intellectually. John spent so much time believing that his will was law, that he completely lost the ability to understand reality. He lived in a bubble of flattery and fear that isolated him so much from the real world, that when he was finally forced to confront the truth about his incompetence, it was too late for any redemption. John's solitary death at Newark Castle was not just the end of a life, but the end of an era. With him died the illusion that noble blood guaranteed competence, that divine authority was sufficient to govern free men, that brute force could indefinitely replace political legitimacy. His corpse carried to the grave not only the frustrated dreams of a failed man, but an entire medieval conception of kingship that could no longer sustain itself in the face of the social and political transformations of his time. Thus ended the life of John Lackland, the king who had everything and lost everything, who reigned over vast territories, but died without even the esteem of his subjects. His story remains a grim reminder that power, when divorced from competence and legitimacy, is not a blessing but a curse that consumes both the ruler and the ruled. In the glacial solitude of that room in Newark Castle, as life ebbed from his glazed eyes, John finally understood a truth he had spent his life trying to deny. A king without a kingdom is nothing more than an ordinary man facing alone the inevitability of death and the unbearable weight of his own failures.